Lesson 7.4, Properties of Special Parallelograms. All of the following are parallelograms. We have a rhombus that has 4 congruent sides. We have a rectangle which has 4 right angles. If it is both a rhombus and a rectangle, then it's a square. If all the sides are congruent and it has the 4 right angles, it's a square. So rhombus is the congruent sides, rectangles are the right angles, square is both. If we use a Venn diagram, we have some parallelograms out here, and you can see that they just have opposite sides that are parallel. All rhombuses are inside of the parallelogram, so all rhombuses are parallelograms. And they have the 4 congruent sides. All rectangles are also parallelograms. They have the 4 right angles. And where they overlap, so we have the 4 right angles and the 4 congruent sides, you get squares. So all squares are rhombuses, all squares are rectangles, all squares are parallelograms. All rhombuses are parallelograms, but not all rhombuses are squares. All squares are rhombuses, but not all rhombuses are squares. For any rectangle EFGH, is it always or sometimes true that FG is congruent to GH? I don't know. Maybe we could draw a rectangle. So we have 4 right angles. We have E, F, G, H. Is FG congruent to GH? Well, in this case, it's not. So it's not always. So there must be sometimes. When would it be? If those were congruent, then it would be a square. So the rectangle would have those sides congruent only if it was a square. Let's try another. Classify this. Well, since I know the opposite sides are parallel, then that tells me it is a parallelogram. And if it's a parallelogram, then opposite sides are congruent. So this side has 1 mark, so this side should have 1 mark. The bottom has 1 mark, so the top has 1 mark. Oh, notice all the sides have 1 mark. That means it is all the sides are congruent, which makes it a rhombus. The angles are not 90 degrees, so the best answer, the most specific answer, is rhombus. Diagonals. The rhombus, the diagonals are perpendicular. Why? Well, if it's a rhombus, this is congruent. All the sides are congruent. And since it's a parallelogram, the diagonals bisect each other. Thus, all those little triangles are congruent by SSS, which means that these angles in the middle are congruent by CPC-TC. And if they're a linear pair and congruent, that means they're 90 degrees and a right angle. Thus, the diagonals are perpendicular. Also in a rhombus, the diagonals bisect the opposite angles. And it's the same reason. If the little triangles are congruent by side, 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 then the corresponding angles are congruent by CPC-TC. And in a rectangle, the diagonals are congruent. And this is saying the whole diagonal is congruent. It's because that triangle is congruent to this triangle by side, angle, side, which makes the diagonals congruent by CBCTC. But since they're also a parallelogram, the diagonals bisect each other, so each individual part of the diagonals, each half, are congruent to each other. All right, so we have a rhombus. Find the measure of angle BCE, so this one here. Well, if it's a rhombus, then the diagonals bisect the opposite angles, which means all four of those angles are congruent. So measure of angle BCE is the same as measure of angle BAE, which is 53 degrees. All right. What is the measure of angle ABD? So this one right there. Well, this makes a right triangle, and we know that the angles in a right triangle, or the angles in any triangle, add up to 180, or if you remember, the acute angles in a right triangle add up to 90. So subtract the 53 and you get 37. One more. What is the measure of angle AED? So this angle here in the middle, that's where the diagonals meet. So it is 90 degrees. Because the diagonals of a rhombus are perpendicular. Let's do another example. Here we have QS and RT, and it's a rectangle. It says it's a rectangle. So in a rectangle, the diagonals are congruent. So I can make these diagonals equal to each other. So we could get the x's on the same side. Then get everything away from the x. We'll add the 15. And then divide by the 5. So x is 8. Now that doesn't answer the question. I need to actually plug it in. QS is 7 times x minus 15. Well, let's see. 7 times 8 is 56, minus 15 is 41. So QS is 41, and RT will also be 41 because they are congruent.